Vexkari had been hunting for 17 cycles, and he had never lost a target. Not once, not ever. And he was not about to start now. His ship, the Crimson Talon, cut through the darkness of space like a blade through flesh, and its engines hummed, with the promise of credits waiting to be collected at the end of this chase. The target was a young female from the Selvari species, and her name was Lyrian, and she had made the terrible mistake of stealing classified data from the Dominion military archives. The bounty on her head was enormous, and when Vexkari had first seen the number, he had thought it was a mistake. But it was not a mistake, and now he understood why 6 other hunters had joined the chase. He sat in his command chair and watched the scanner display with all 4 of his eyes, and his mandibles clicked together in anticipation as he tracked the faint ion trail left behind by Lyrian's damaged shuttle. She was good at running, but she was not good enough. His navigation officer, a thin creature named Torvis, worked at his station with nervous energy, and his fingers moved across the controls as he calculated the trajectory of their prey. She changed course again, Torvis announced, and his voice carried a hint of admiration for the fleeing female. Vexkari leaned forward in his chair and studied the new heading, and something cold began to form in his stomach. Where is she going now? He asked, even though he was beginning to suspect the answer. Torvis was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had changed from admiration to something closer to fear. She's heading cold. Commander, the cold feeling in Vexkari's stomach spread through his entire body, and he felt his forearms grow tense against the armrests of his chair. Cold, he repeated, and the word tasted like ash in his mouth. That direction leads to human space. Torvis finished for him, and he turned to look at his commander with wide eyes. She's running directly toward human space. Vexkari stood up from his chair and walked to the main viewport, and he stared out at the stars ahead of them, and somewhere out there beyond those distant lights was the border of territory controlled by the humans. He had heard stories about human space, and every hunter in the galaxy had heard those stories, and none of the stories were good. The humans were a strange species, and they had only been part of galactic civilization for a few hundred cycles, but in that short time they had built a reputation that made even the most hardened killers nervous. They were not the strongest species, and they were not the fastest, and their technology was good, but not exceptional, and yet something about them made predators hesitate. Vexkari watched his scanner, and he saw something that made his mandibles click together in surprise. The other hunters were slowing down. The Greth twins, who were famous for their brutality and their willingness to chase targets into the most dangerous regions of space, had cut their engine power by half. The Keshin Tracker drone, an automated killing machine that felt no fear and no hesitation, had stopped accelerating entirely. Even the Vareth Death Cult assassin, a member of a species that welcomed death as a sacred gift, had begun to fall behind one by one. The pursuit signatures on his scanner grew weaker and weaker as the other hunters made the same calculation that was now running through Vexkari's mind. The bounty was enormous, but was it worth crossing into human territory? Commander, Torvis said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. The others are giving up. Vexkari did not respond immediately, and he continued to stare at the stars, and he thought about the 17 cycles he had spent building his reputation as a hunter who never failed. He thought about the credits waiting for him if he completed this job, and he thought about his retirement, and he thought about never having to chase another terrified target across the cold emptiness of space. And then he thought about the stories he had heard about hunters who crossed into human space and never came back, and he had heard about ships found drifting at the border with their crews, alive, but their weapons completely disabled, and he had heard about what the humans did to those who broke their laws. The humans did not kill their prisoners, and that was the strange thing, and in some ways that made them more terrifying than species who did kill, because at least with death, you knew what to expect. With humans, you never knew what they would do. and you only knew that whatever it was would be precise and permanent and designed to send a message to everyone who might consider following in your footsteps. Commander, Torvis said again, and this time there was urgency in his voice. Do we continue the pursuit or do we fall back with the others? Vexkari turned away from the viewport, and he looked at his navigation officer, and he saw the fear in the smaller creature's eyes. For a moment, he considered giving the order to stop and to turn around and to let some other fool chase Lyrian into human territory. But then he thought about his reputation, and he thought about the bounty, and he thought about 17 cycles of never failing. We continue, he said, and his voice was steady, even though his hearts were beating fast. The humans cannot be everywhere, and she is one small female in a damaged ship, and we will be fast and we will be careful, and we will collect our bounty before anyone even knows we were there. Torvis opened his mouth to protest, but something in Vexkari's expression made him close it again, and he simply nodded and turned back to his console. The Crimson Talon accelerated, and it pulled ahead of the other hunters. And soon it was alone in the darkness, chasing a faint ion trail toward a border that wiser beings would not cross. Behind them, the other hunters watched the Crimson Talon disappear into the distance, and not one of them moved to follow the Greth. Twins turned their ship around and headed back toward the station where they would find another bounty and forget about Lyrian. The Keshan tracker drone received new orders from its controllers and began plotting a course toward a different target. In safer space, the Vorath assassin sat in meditation, and he whispered a prayer for Vexkari's soul because he knew what waited in human territory, and he knew that some fates were worse than the death his religion promised. Only Vexkari continued forward, and only Vexkari maintained the chase, and only Vexkari was foolish enough, or brave enough, or greedy enough to ignore the warnings that every other hunter had already heard. Ahead of him, the stars burned cold and bright, and somewhere among them was the invisible line that separated known space from human territory. He was about to cross that line, and he did not yet understand what that would mean. But he would learn. They always did. Way Station Orinth floated in the darkness at the edge of known space, and it served as the last stop before the border of human territory, and it was a place where hunters gathered to drink and trade stories and prepare themselves for whatever came next. Vexkari docked his ship and walked through the crowded corridors of the station, and he could feel the eyes of other species watching him as he passed. They knew who he was, and they knew what he was chasing, and they knew where his target had gone. The cantina was dimly lit and filled with smoke from a dozen different intoxicants, and Vexkari pushed through the crowd until he found an empty table near the back wall. He ordered a drink and waited, and he did not have to wait long. The Greth twins approached his table, and they sat down without asking permission, and their identical faces wore identical expressions of tired resignation. "We saw your ship heading toward the border," one of them said, and his voice was flat and empty of emotion. "We are out of the hunt," the other twin added, and he stared at his drink instead of meeting Vexkari's eyes. "The bounty is not worth it." Vexkari made a sound of disbelief, and his mandibles clicked together in annoyance. "She is one small female," he said, and he spread all four of his arms in a gesture of confusion. "Her ship is damaged, and she has no weapons and no allies, and the humans cannot be everywhere at once." The twins looked at each other, and something passed between them, and then they both shook their heads slowly. "You do not understand," the first twin said. "You have never worked in human space." The second twin added, "Neither have you," Vexkari pointed out. The twins were silent for a moment, and then the first one spoke again, and his voice was quieter now. "We had a cousin who worked in human space once, and he was tracking a target just like you are tracking yours, and he was careful, and he was quiet, and he thought he could get in and get out before anyone noticed. What happened to him?" Vexkari asked. "He came back," the second twin said, and there was something strange in his voice. "But he was not the same after that, and he never told us exactly what." happened, and he never worked as a hunter again, and sometimes at night we would hear him screaming in his sleep. Vexkari felt a chill run down his spine, but he forced himself to remain calm, and he told himself that one story did not mean anything. A new voice spoke from the table beside them, and Vexkari turned to see a weathered Keshin tracker sitting alone with a drink in his hand. "I can tell you what happens," the Keshin said, and he smiled, but there was no humor in that smile. "I tracked a target into human territory 5 cycles ago, and I thought I was smart enough to avoid detection." He pulled back the sleeve of his jacket and revealed his left arm, and Vexkari felt his stomachs turn at what he saw. The arm was prosthetic, and it was crude and functional, and clearly not the original limb. "3 of their rangers found me," the Keshin continued, and his voice was calm, as if he was discussing the weather. "They did not yell, and they did not threaten, and they simply appeared out of nowhere and surrounded me before I could even reach for my weapon." "What are rangers?" Vexkari asked. "They are the humans who enforce their laws in the outer territories," the Keshin explained. "They are not military, and they are not police, and they are something else entirely, and they are very, very good at what they do." He took a long drink and then continued his story. "They gave me a choice, and they said I could leave the arm or I could leave my life, and I thought they were bluffing, because what kind of species offers a choice like that instead of simply killing their enemy? They were not bluffing," Vexkari guessed. "They were not bluffing," the Keshin confirmed. "I chose to keep my life, and they removed my arm right there in the cargo hold of my own ship, and they did it quickly and cleanly, and they even stopped the bleeding before they left." He held up his prosthetic arm and turned it slowly in the light. "The strange thing is that they apologized while they were doing it, and they said they did not enjoy causing pain, and they said they hoped I would make better choices in the future, and then they vanished as quietly as they had appeared." More hunters had gathered around them now, and they added their own stories to the growing pile of warnings. A Morvuk smuggler spoke about a friend who had tried to run illegal cargo through human space, and the humans had confiscated the cargo, but let the smuggler go free with nothing but a warning and a map showing the fastest route out of their territory. A Zeleth assassin told the story of a Varath death cultist who had been sent to kill a human diplomat, and the Varath was one of the most feared killers in the galaxy, and he had never failed a mission in his entire life. The humans had caught him before he got within 10 kilometers of his target, and they had done something to him, and nobody knew exactly what, but when he returned to his clan, he was no longer capable of violence, and his venom glands had been surgically removed, and there was a handwritten note pinned to his chest. The note said, "Next time we keep more." Vexkari listened to all of these stories, and he felt the cold fear growing stronger in his chest, but he also felt something else. He felt stubborn pride. He had spent 17 cycles building his reputation, and he had never failed. And he was not going to let a bunch of soft pink mammals scare him away from the biggest bounty of his career. "These are just stories," he said, and he stood up from his table. "The humans cannot be as dangerous as you all claim, because if they were that dangerous, they would have conquered the galaxy by now." The Keshin tracker laughed, but it was a sad sound. "That is what I thought too," he said, and he raised his prosthetic arm in a mocking salute. "Good luck, bounty hunter, and try to keep all of your limbs." Vexkari walked out of the cantina, and he ignored the whispers that followed him, and he made his way back to his ship. Torvis was waiting for him in the cockpit, and his face was pale and worried. "Commander, I have been monitoring the communications channels," he said, and his voice shook slightly. "There are more stories about human space, and none of them are good, and I think perhaps we should reconsider this mission." Vexkari sat down in his command chair, and he stared at the viewport, and he thought about everything he had heard in the cantina. The humans did not kill their prisoners, and that was what made them so terrifying. A dead enemy was simply dead, but an enemy who returned home, changed and broken and afraid, served as a warning to everyone. else who might consider crossing into human space. It was smart and it was cruel and it was effective, and yet Vexkari could not bring himself to turn back. Set a course for the border, he ordered, and his voice was steady, even though his hearts were racing. Torvis hesitated for a long moment, and then he nodded and began entering the coordinates. The Crimson Talon left Way Station Orinth behind, and it headed toward the invisible line that separated known space from human territory. Vexkari watched the stars grow closer, and he told himself that he was different from the other hunters, and he was smarter and more careful, and he would succeed where others had failed. He almost believed it. The border of human space was not marked by any physical barrier, and there were no stations or patrol ships or warning beacons floating in the darkness. There was simply a line on the navigation charts, and on one side of that line was the rest of the galaxy, and on the other side was territory controlled by humans. Vexkari watched his display as the Crimson Talon crossed that invisible line, and he held his breath and waited for something to happen. Nothing happened. No alarms sounded, and no ships appeared on his scanner, and the stars looked exactly the same on this side of the border as they had on the other side. Let out a slow breath and felt some of the tension leave his body. Perhaps the stories had been exaggerated, and perhaps the humans were not as dangerous as everyone claimed, and perhaps this mission would be easier than he had feared. I am detecting the ion trail again, Torvis reported from his station, and his voice was still nervous, but there was also a hint of relief. The target appears to be heading toward a small colony world in this system. What is the planet called? Vexkari asked. Torvis checked his data and then looked up with a confused expression. The humans call it New Caledonia, and according to our records, it is an agricultural world with a small population and no military presence. Vexkari felt a smile spread across his face, and his mandibles clicked together in satisfaction. This was perfect. His target had fled to a farming colony with no defenses and no soldiers, and he would simply land and collect her and be gone before anyone could respond. Take us in, he ordered, but disable our weapons signatures first and mask our pursuit transponders and fly casual routes that look like merchant traffic. Torvis nodded and began making the adjustments, and the Crimson Talon changed its profile to appear as a harmless trading vessel. They flew through human space for 2 full cycles, and during that time Vexkari saw no patrol ships and no military vessels, and no sign that anyone even knew they were there. He began to relax, and he began to think that all those stories in the cantina had been nothing but exaggeration and superstition. The humans were just another species, and they were not special, and they were not particularly dangerous, and the other hunters had been fools to give up such a valuable bounty. On the 3rd day, everything changed. Vexkari was sitting in his command chair, reviewing the approach vectors to New Caledonia, when the lights on his ship flickered. It was a small thing, and it lasted only a moment, and he might have ignored it as a minor power fluctuation. But then his communications array activated on its own. A voice spoke through the speakers, and it was calm and clear and perfectly pleasant, and it sent ice through Vexkari's veins. Delosian vessel with registry unknown. You are in violation of Human Colonial Sovereignty Act 7. Vexkari lunged for his controls, but nothing responded, and his ship continued on its previous course as Bespiris. If he was not even touching the instruments, the voice continued speaking in that same calm tone. Pursuing sapient beings for bounty collection is prohibited in our space, and you have 12 hours to exit our borders, and this is your only warning. And then the voice was gone, and the lights stopped flickering, and his controls responded again, and everything returned to normal. Except nothing was normal, because someone had just taken control of his ship from a distance and spoken to him through systems that should have been completely secure. Commander, Torvis whispered, and his face was pale with fear. How did they know what we are? Vexkari did not answer because he did not have an answer. He checked his scanners again and again, and there was nothing there, and no ships, and no stations, and no explanation for how a human voice had appeared inside his vessel. His instincts screamed at him to turn around and to run and to get out of human space as fast as his engines could carry him, but the target was so close. New Caledonia was only a few hours away, and Lyrian was down there somewhere, and the bounty was waiting, and all he had to do was be fast and careful. "They gave us 12 hours, he said, and his voice sounded strange in his own ears. "We only need 6. Commander, please," Torvis begged, and there were tears forming in his eyes. "We should listen to the warning, and we should leave, and we should forget about this bounty." Vex Kari looked at his navigation officer, and he saw the terror in the smaller creature's face, and for a moment he almost agreed. But 17 cycles of never failing pushed him forward, and greed whispered in his ear, and pride refused to let him turn back. "Now we continue," he said, and the words felt like a death sentence. "Prepare for atmospheric entry." Torvis closed his eyes, and his lips moved in what might have been a prayer to whatever gods his species worshipped, and then he turned back to his console and began the descent sequence. The Crimson Talon dropped toward New Caledonia, and as it fell through the atmosphere, Vexkari looked out at the green and blue world below him. It was beautiful in the way that all living worlds were beautiful, and he could see oceans and forests and the patchwork patterns of farmland spreading across the continents. Somewhere down there was his target, and somewhere down there was his bounty, and somewhere down there were humans who had already warned him once. He told himself he would be careful, and he told himself he would be fast, and he told himself he would be gone before anyone could stop him. He had been telling himself a lot of things lately. The ship landed in a field several kilometers from the settlement, where his scanners had detected Lyrian's biosignature, and Vexkari gathered his equipment and checked his weapons and prepared to complete his mission. The air outside smelled like grass and flowers and something else that he could not identify, and the sky above him was a perfect shade of blue with white clouds drifting slowly across it. It was peaceful and quiet, and there was no sign of danger anywhere. That should have worried him more than it did. He began walking toward the settlement, and he moved carefully, and he kept to the shadows, and he watched for any sign of human activity. The fields around him were empty, and the only sound was the wind moving through the crops and the distant calls of unfamiliar birds. He was getting closer now, and he could see the buildings of the settlement ahead of him, and he could see lights in the windows, and he could see people moving in the streets. Just a little further and he would find Lyrian, and he would collect his bounty, and he would prove that all those stories about human space were nothing but lies. He never saw them coming. One moment he was walking through an empty field, and the next moment he was face down in the dirt with a boot pressing against his weapon hand and his other 3 arms being expertly bound behind his back. He had not heard footsteps, and he had not seen movement, and he had not detected anything on his personal scanner. They had simply appeared out of nowhere, like ghosts materializing from the evening. Airy voice spoke above him, and it was calm and conversational, and somehow more terrifying than any threat could have been. "You were warned." The voice said. Vexkari tried to struggle, but the hands holding him knew exactly where to apply pressure to keep him immobilized, and he realized with growing horror that they understood his anatomy perfectly. The humans had studied his species, and they knew how to restrain him, and they knew how to hurt him, and they probably knew exactly how many hearts were beating in his chest right now. He stopped struggling. It would not help anyway. 3 humans stood over Vexkari as he lay in the dirt with his arms bound and his face pressed against the ground. They did not look like soldiers, and they did not look like police, and they looked like farmers in simple clothes with dirt on their boots and calluses on their hands, but their eyes told a different story. Their eyes were calm and watchful, and there was something behind them that spoke of experience and training, and a complete willingness to do whatever was necessary. The oldest of the 3 crouched down beside Vexkari and studied him with an expression that was almost curious. "You are the Thylosian from the ship we detected 3 days ago." The human said, and it was not a question. "We have been watching you since you crossed the border." 3 days. They had known about him for 3 days. And they had let him fly through their space, and they had let him land on their planet, and they had let him walk right into their hands. Vexkari felt sick. The bounty. He started to say, but the human held up a hand and stopped him. "The bounty means nothing here," the human said, and his voice was patient, like he was explaining something to a child. "Bounty hunting is illegal in human space, and it does not matter how much money someone is offering, and it does not matter what crimes your target supposedly committed. She stole classified military data." Vexkari protested, and he tried to make his voice strong, but it came out weak and desperate. "The Dominion wants her brought to justice." The human smiled, and it was a sad expression that carried no warmth. "Justice," he repeated, and he said the word like it tasted bad in his mouth. "Is that what the Dominion calls it now?" He stood up and gestured to the other 2 humans, and they lifted Vexkari to his feet and held him upright between them. "Let me tell you a story," the older human said, and he began walking toward the settlement. And the others followed, dragging Vexkari along with them. "The girl you were hunting is named Lyrian, and she is from a species called the Selvari, and her people have been under Dominion control for 6 generations." Vexkari said nothing, and he focused on keeping his feet moving as they walked. "The Dominion has been using the Selvari as labor for their mining operations." The human continued, and his voice remained calm and conversational. "They work them in conditions that no species should have to endure, and they pay them nothing, and they punish any resistance with public executions." They entered the settlement, and Vexkari saw humans everywhere, and they stopped what they were doing to watch as he was led through the streets. None of them looked surprised, and none of them looked concerned, and they simply watched with those same calm eyes that the 3 Rangers had. Lyrian did not steal military data. The human said, "She copied evidence of Dominion war crimes against her people, and she was trying to bring that evidence to the Galactic Council so someone might actually help the Selvari." They stopped in front of a small building with a sign that Vexkari could not read, and through the windows he could see medical equipment and beds and children playing in a waiting area. "She has been working here since she arrived," the human said, and he pointed at the building. "She has been helping our doctors treat sick children, and she has been learning our language, and she has been slowly beginning to believe that there are places in the galaxy where people do not have to be afraid." Vexkari looked through the window, and he saw Lyrian standing inside, and she was holding a small human child, and there was a smile on her face. It was the first time he had seen his target as anything other than a bounty. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, and his voice was quiet now. The human turned to face him, and there was something in his expression that Vexkari could not identify. "Because I want you to understand why we do what we do," the human said. "I want you to understand why bounty hunters do not operate in our space." He gestured at the settlement around them, and at the fields beyond, and at the sky above. "We are not the strongest species in the galaxy," he said. "We know that, and we do not pretend otherwise, and we have no delusions about our place in the cosmic hierarchy." Vexkari felt confusion mixing with his fear, because this was not what he had expected to hear. "We do not have the best technology," the human continued. "We do not have the largest fleet, and we do not have the most powerful weapons, and there are a dozen species that could probably conquer us, if they really wanted to." "Then why?" Vexkari asked, and he genuinely did not understand. "Why do hunters avoid your space, and why are there so many stories, and why does everyone seem so afraid of you?" The human smiled again, and this time there was something almost gentle in the expression. "Because we remember," he said simply. Vexkari waited for more, and when nothing came, he spoke again. "Remember what?" The human's eyes grew distant for a moment, as if he was looking at something far away. "And long ago, we remember what it was like to be hunted," he said, and his voice was softer now. "We remember the slavers who came to our world before we reached the stars, and we remember the predator species who saw us as prey, and we remember the empires that wanted to use us as resources. He looked at Vexkari, and there was fire behind those calm eyes. We crawled out of that history with our fingernails. He said, we fought, and we suffered, and we died by the millions, and we refused to give up, and eventually we won our freedom. He stepped closer, and Vexkari found himself unable to look away. And when we finally reached the stars, we made a decision. The human said, we decided collectively as a species that our space would be different, and our space would be a place where the hunted could run to, and not just run from. Understanding began to dawn in Vexkari's mind, and with it came a new kind of fear. You protect them, he said, and the words felt heavy on his tongue. Anyone who comes to you for help. Anyone who needs it, the human confirmed. We do not ask where they came from, and we do not ask what they did, and we simply give them a place to be safe. He gestured at Lyrian through the window. She came to us terrified and alone and carrying evidence of terrible crimes, and we gave her shelter, and we gave her work, and we gave her a chance to be something other than a victim. The human turned back to Vexkari, and his expression hardened. And then you came to take her back to the people who were hurting her. Vexkari felt shame rising in his chest, and it was an unfamiliar feeling, and he did not like it. I did not know, he said, and the excuse sounded weak even to his own ears. You did not care. The human corrected him. You saw a bounty, and you saw credits, and you did not stop to ask why someone would be running so hard or where she was running from. He was right, and Vexkari knew he was right, and there was nothing he could say in his own defense. What happens now? He asked, and he braced himself for the worst. The human studied him for a long moment, and then he spoke. Your ship is being escorted to the border as we speak, he said. Your navigation officer is unharmed, and he will be waiting for you when you arrive. Vexkari blinked in surprise, because this was not what he had expected at all. You are letting me go, he asked, and he could not keep the confusion from his voice. We are giving you a choice, the human said, and there was that word again, and Vexkari remembered the stories from the cantina. You can leave peacefully, and you can go back to your life, and you can pretend this never happened. And if I refuse, Vexkari asked, even though he was not sure, he wanted to know the answer. The human smiled, and it was not a cruel expression, but it was not a kind one either. Then you will learn why that Vorath assassin still wakes up screaming. Vexkari remembered that story, and he remembered the note that had been pinned to the Vorath's chest, and he felt true fear for the first time in 17 cycles. I will leave, he said quickly. I thought you might, the human replied, and he sounded almost disappointed. 3 cycles had passed since Vexkari left human space, and he found himself sitting in the same cantina on Waystation, Arendt, where he had dismissed all those warnings. The drink in front of him had gone warm hours ago, but he made no move to order another. He could not stop thinking about what had happened on New Caledonia. The humans had released him just as they had promised, and they had given him back his weapons, and they had escorted him to the border without laying another hand on him. They had not hurt him at all, and somehow that was worse than if they had beaten him or imprisoned him or taken something from his body. The way they had taken the Keshan's arm, they had simply shown him the truth and let him walk away with the weight of that truth pressing down on his shoulders. He had been hunting a refugee, and he had been planning to drag her back to people who would hurt her. And he had not cared about any of that, because the bounty was good 17 cycles of hunting, and he had never once stopped to ask why his targets were running. The cantina was crowded tonight, and Vexkari recognized many of the faces around him as hunters who worked the outer systems, and some of them were good at their jobs, and some of them were cruel, and all of them were exactly like him. He felt sick looking at Thema Younghunter approached his table and sat down without asking permission, and his eyes were bright with excitement, and his movements were eager and confident. You are Vexkari, the young hunter said, and it was not a question. I have heard stories about you, and they say you never fail. Vexkari said nothing and continued staring at his warm drink. I am tracking a bounty. The young hunter continued, and he leaned forward with enthusiasm. A political dissident who fled from the Tarkin Collective, and the bounty is enormous, but the target ran into human territory. He laughed, and the sound was sharp and careless. Everyone tells me to give up, but I think they are all cowards, and think the stories about human space are exaggerated, and I think I can get in and out before anyone notices. Vexkari finally looked up, and he studied the young hunter's face, and he saw himself from 3 cycles ago. He saw the arrogance and the greed and the complete inability to imagine that anything could go wrong. "Do not go," he said, and his voice was flat and empty. The young hunter blinked in surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean, do not go into human space," Vexkari said, and he pushed his drink aside and leaned forward. "I mean, forget about that bounty and find another target and stay as far away from the human border as your ship will carry you." The young hunter laughed again, but there was uncertainty in the sound now. "I thought you never failed," he said. "I thought you were supposed to be the best. I went into human space," Vexkari said quietly. "I crossed the border 3 cycles ago, and I landed on one of their worlds, and I thought I was smarter than everyone else." He held up his 4 arms and turned them slowly. "They did not take any of my limbs," he said. "They did not hurt me at all, and they just talked to me and showed me things, and then they let me go." The young hunter looked confused. "Then, what is the problem?" Vexkari was silent for a long moment as he tried to find the words to explain something that he still did not fully understand himself. "The humans are not soft," he finally said. "Everyone thinks they are soft because they do not kill their prisoners, and they do not torture their enemies, and they follow rules that seem like weakness." He shook his head slowly. "But they are not weak, and they are not soft. And they are something else entirely." "What are they then?" The young hunter asked. Vexkari thought about the 3 rangers who had materialized from empty air, and he thought about the way they had known exactly how to restrain his species, and he thought about the calm certainty in their eyes. He thought about the oldest ranger's words about remembering what it was like to be hunted, and he thought about a species that had collectively decided to turn their territory into a sanctuary for refugees and runaways and anyone else who needed protection. He thought about Lyrian holding that human child and smiling for perhaps the first time in her life. "They are patient," he said slowly. "They are principled, and they are consistent. And they have decided that their little corner of the galaxy will be safe for the hunted, whether the rest of us like it or not." He looked at the young hunter, and his voice grew harder. "They are not the apex predators of the galaxy, and they know it. And they do not care, and they have built something more dangerous than any empire." "What is that?" The young hunter whispered. "They have built a reputation," Vexkari said. "Every hunter who crosses into their space learns the same lesson. I learned, and some of us lose limbs, and some of us lose worse things, and all of us come back with stories." He gestured at the cantina around them. "Look at this room and count how many hunters are here, and then ask yourself how many of them would cross into human territory for any bounty, no matter how large." The young hunter looked around, and his enthusiasm was fading fast. "None of them," Vexkari answered for him. "Not one, and they have all heard the stories, and they all know what happens, and the humans do not need a large fleet or powerful weapons because they have something better." He stood up from his table and reached into his belt pouch and pulled out a small chip and placed it on the table in front of the young hunter. It was his competitor registration, and it was the identification that marked him as an active bounty hunter in the Galactic Registry. "What are you doing?" the young hunter asked. "I am done," Vexkari said, and the words felt like freedom. "I spent 17 cycles hunting people, and I never once asked why they were running, and I never once cared about anything except the credits at the end." He thought about the ranger's words about species that prey on the hunted, and he realized that he had been exactly that kind of predator. The humans showed me what I was. He said, they did not need to hurt me because the truth was punishment enough. He turned and walked toward the door of the cantina, and behind him he heard the young hunter calling out, "Wait, and where are you going, and what am I supposed to do?" Vexkari stopped at the door and looked back over his shoulder. "I do not know where I am going," he said honestly, "but I am not going to spend the rest of my life chasing frightened people across the galaxy." He paused and considered the young hunter's second question. "As for you, I would suggest finding another profession," he said. "There are easier ways to make credits, and there are safer targets to hunt, and there are plenty of jobs that do not involve asking yourself what kind of person you have become." He pushed through the door and walked out into the corridor of the station. And behind him, he left his old life like a shed skin through the viewport at the end of the corridor. He could see the distant stars of human space glittering in the darkness. They were not a warning anymore. They were a reminder somewhere out there was a species that had been hunted once and had decided that they would spend the rest of their existence making sure others did not have to suffer the same fate. They were not the strongest, and they were not the most advanced, and they were not the most numerous, but they were the ones that predators learned to avoid, and perhaps that made them the most dangerous species in the galaxy. After all, not because of what they could do to their enemies, but because of what they could make their enemies. Seeing them, Vexkari walked away from the viewport and headed toward the docking bay, where his ship was waiting. He did not know what he was going to do with the rest of his life, but he knew one thing for certain: he would never hunt another living being again. The humans had not taken his limbs or his freedom or his life. They had taken something far more valuable. They had taken his ability to pretend that what he did was acceptable, and that was a wound that would never heal. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps that was exactly what they wanted him to carry back with him into the wider galaxy, a story and a warning and a truth that could not be unlearned. Climbed aboard his ship and set a course for nowhere in particular, and as the Crimson Talon pulled away from way station Orinth, he found himself smiling. It was a strange feeling after everything that had happened, but it felt like the beginning of something new, and for the first time in 17 cycles, Vexkari was looking forward to finding out what that something might be.